There are truths the Imperium of Man has spent 10,000 years refusing to examine. That the Emperor is not a god, but a corpse kept breathing by the faith of 1 trillion souls. That the Golden Throne is not a seat of divine power, but a machine slowly losing the war against entropy. That somewhere in the vast and screaming dark, something older than humanity's oldest prayers has been watching, and has finally decided to pay a visit. He didn't arrive in fire. He didn't tear open a warp rift or descend in a column of divine radiance. There was no thunderclap, no choir of celestial voices, no omen in the augur arrays of Battlefleet Solar. One moment, the space above Terra was occupied only by the eternal traffic of pilgrim ships, Navy frigates, and the slow-turning enormity of orbital defense platforms. The next moment, and something was simply there, a singularity of presence that didn't register as a ship, a missile, a psychic phenomenon, or a warp intrusion. It registered as nothing. And nothing, in the Imperium's experience, was always the most dangerous category. The first to notice were the astropaths stationed in the Astronomicon relay towers on Terra's northern polar complex. They didn't see anything. They felt it. A sudden, inexplicable silence in the warp song that had hummed beneath their perception since their soul binding. Not the terrifying silence of a null, not the predatory quiet of a pariah. Something else. A silence that felt, one astropath would later describe before her superiors had her executed for heresy, like the moment before someone very important walks into the room. He came down through the atmosphere without a vessel, without a void suit, without any apparent concern for the thermodynamic realities of orbital re-entry. He fell at a speed that should have turned him into a contrail of vapor and ionized gas, and instead he descended like a man stepping off a particularly high curb, mildly inconvenient beneath his dignity to acknowledge. He landed on the processional of saints 3 kilometers from the Eternity Gate, in the heart of the Sanctum Imperialis. The paving stones cracked beneath his feet, not from force, from presence, as if reality itself was making room. He was tall, pale as cathedral marble, dressed in a suit of white so clean it seemed to generate its own light in the perpetual industrial smog of Terra's atmosphere. In his face was the kind of face that great sculptors spent their lives trying to approximate and always failed. Not because it was perfect, but because it was aware. Every angle of it spoke of intelligence so profound it had long since passed through arrogance and come out the other side into something quieter and far more dangerous. He looked around at the towering monuments, the endless Gothic spires, the kilometer-high statues of saints and primarchs, and the Emperor's own image rendered in granite and adamantium. He looked at the streams of pilgrims in their threadbare devotional robes, the columns of Adeptus Arbites in carapace armor, the distant silhouettes of custodian guard on the Eternity Gate's battlements. He took it all in with the unhurried attention of a man visiting a museum that held some personal significance. Then he smiled. It was not a reassuring smile. "Charming," he said, to no one in particular. His voice was resonant and precise, carrying over the noise of the processional the way a single piano note carries over an orchestra, not by volume, but by clarity. Someone has spent a very long time compensating for something. The pilgrims nearest to him had stopped moving. Some were staring, some were already backing away. a child near the front of a devotional procession, too young to know what fear was supposed to look like, stared up at him with wide eyes and asked, without any apparent prompting, "Are you an angel?" He looked down at her with an expression that was genuinely, if briefly, unguarded. "I was," he said. "I found the work unsatisfying." The Vox network of the Sanctum Imperialis lit up approximately 4 seconds later, and the word that traveled fastest through the channels wasn't threat or Xenos or even heretic. It was a word that had no official designation in the Imperium's vast taxonomies of enemies and aberrations. It was a word that came from the most ancient and suppressed theological archives, from texts the ecclesiarchy had spent centuries burning. Lightbringer. If you crave stories of cosmic collisions and impossible powers walking through the darkest future humanity has ever known, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to the dark millennium. But tonight, even the Emperor may need protection. The custodians on the Eternity Gate were already moving. The High Lords would be woken from their deliberations within the hour. And somewhere beneath the palace, in the deepest and most sacred chamber in human civilization, the Golden Throne pulsed with an energy that had no precedent in its 10,000 years of operation. Something had arrived on Terra that the Imperium had no category for. Something that had once held a rank above every angel, every demon, every god the galaxy had ever produced, and he was already walking toward the palace like he owned it. He wasn't wrong to. The Eternity Gate had never been breached, not during the Horus Heresy, when the War Master's armies had broken themselves against it like waves against a cliff face of gold and ceramite, not during the age of apostasy, when a madman sat the ecclesiarchal throne and turned the Imperium's institutions against each other, not in 10,000 years of siege, sabotage, assassination attempt, and demonic incursion. The gate stood as the Imperium's single, most inviolable promise to itself, that there was one place in all the galaxy where humanity's heart would not be touched. Lucifer Morningstar walked through it because it was open. The custodians had sealed the outer processional barriers and deployed in a cordon 200 meters deep. 10 of the Emperor's personal guard in their auramite plate, each one a masterwork of genetic and spiritual engineering that had taken decades to produce. They stood between him and the gate with their guardian spears leveled, their auramite catching the pale Terran light, their faces invisible behind their crested helms. They were the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. They radiated threat the way a star radiated heat, constantly, effortlessly, in all directions. He stopped in front of them and clasped his hands behind his back. "Good morning," he said. "I'd like to come in." "You will not advance further." The lead custodian's voice through his helm's Vox grill was flat and absolute, the voice of a man who had never in his life been disobeyed. "You will identify yourself, submit to restraint, and be escorted to a secure facility pending investigation by—" "I won't be doing any of those things," Lucifer said pleasantly. "But I appreciate the clarity. It's refreshing. Most people in positions of authority tend to dress their ultimatums up in considerably more language." The Guardian spears fired simultaneously, 10 beams of energy, each capable of burning through several centimeters of adamantium plating, converged on a single point in space. The man in the white suit was still standing there afterward. His suit was still white. He was brushing something invisible from his lapel with the mild expression of someone who had walked through a light drizzle. "The craftsmanship is remarkable," he said, examining the spears with genuine interest. "Truly, in my experience, the quality of a civilization's weapons tells you everything about its psychology. All of this," he gestured broadly at the custodians, the gate, the vast architecture of the palace rising behind them, "speaks of a people who have been afraid for a very, very long time." What happened next would be debated in whispered horror in custodian training halls for generations. The lead custodian, a warrior with 4,000 years of continuous service, a being who had looked into the face of chaos and not flinched, stepped backward. Not in retreat, not in tactical repositioning. He stepped backward the way a man steps back from a fireplace that has suddenly burned much hotter than expected. Lucifer hadn't moved, hadn't threatened, hadn't raised his voice. He had simply, briefly, allowed them to see what he was. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, a glimpse behind the white suit and the precise diction and the sardonic smile, a flash of something so cosmically, fundamentally other that the human architecture of the custodians' minds processed it as physical impact. 3 of them stumbled. 1 fell to one knee, not from injury, from the sudden, bone-deep comprehension that they were standing in front of something that had existed before Terra was a cooling rock in the void, before humanity had climbed down from whatever it had climbed down from, before the galaxy had finished deciding what shape it wanted to be. "I'm not here to fight you," Lucifer said, and his voice was almost gentle. "I'm here because I'm curious, and because something on this planet is producing a sound that can be heard from dimensions you don't have names for." He paused. "Also, if I'm being entirely honest, because I haven't been genuinely surprised in a very long time, and your little civilization is surprising me rather a lot." He walked through them, not around, through, the cordon parting before him, not because they chose to let him pass, but because the alternative was incomprehensible. The Eternity Gate, sealed by mechanisms that required the combined authority of 3 High Lords and a custodian captain to operate, opened. The hinges didn't strain. The locking mechanisms didn't disengage. The gate simply opened, as if it had always intended to, as if 10,000 years of impregnability had been a temporary condition waiting for the right moment to lapse. Inside the outer palace complex, 5,000 Adeptus Custodes stood in full battle array. Behind them, 2 companies of Sisters of Silence, their pariah auras washing over the courtyard in waves of psychic negation that should have suppressed any warp-touched entity. Behind them, artillery emplacements, dreadnoughts, an entire company of ultramarines in emergency deployment from an orbital insertion that had taken 14 minutes from Vox Alert to boots on ground. Lucifer looked at all of it with the expression of a man who has arrived at a dinner party and found the host has gone to considerable effort. "You really shouldn't have," he said. The Sisters of Silence pressed forward, their null aura expanding. It was the Imperium's most reliable weapon against psychic and warp-touched entities, an absence of the immaterium so profound it could silence demons, disrupt psychers, and bring even minor warp gods to their knees. He walked through it like it was weather, because his power wasn't drawn from the warp. It wasn't a psychic phenomenon. wasn't faith-given strength, wasn't demonic energy. It was something the Imperium had no theological framework for. The inheritance of a being made directly by the hand of a creator whose existence predated every religion, every god, in every metaphysical structure the galaxy had ever assembled. The Sisters of Silence negated the immaterium. Lucifer had never needed it. He stopped in the center of the courtyard and looked up at the palace proper. The vast, incomprehensible architecture of humanity's greatest monument, rising into Terra's smog-choked sky like a declaration of stubborn survival. "Take me to whoever is in charge," he said to the assembled military might of the Imperium's heart. "Not the soldiers, not the administrators." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that might, on a less controlled face, have been called anticipation. "Take me to the one on the throne." The silence that followed lasted a full 4 seconds. Then, from somewhere in the senior command structure, a Vox channel crackled open, and a voice said, with the desperate authority of a man who had run completely out of alternatives, "Escort him." The walk through the Imperial Palace took 40 minutes. Not because the throne room was far, though it was, buried beneath kilometers of consecrated stone and adamantium and the accumulated psychic weight of 10,000 years of prayer, but because Lucifer walked slowly, deliberately. He was looking at everything. The custodians flanking him had given up attempting to maintain a threatening posture approximately 3 minutes into the journey. They walked beside him now, with the rigid dignity of men performing a duty they no longer understood the purpose of. Their guardian spears held at parade rest, their eyes forward. Around them, the palace breathed with its own terrible life. The distant choir song of 10,000 servo skulls, the subsonic rumble of the Astronomican's psychic machinery, the smell of incense so thick it had soaked into the stone itself over centuries, and now emanated from the walls like a mineral perfume. Lucifer breathed it in. His expression was thoughtful. "Tell me something," he said to the custodian on his left, the same one who had taken the backward step outside the gate. The warrior's name, though Lucifer didn't know it yet, was Valdor Praxis, and he had served the Emperor without interruption for longer than most imperial worlds had been inhabited. "The one on the throne, how long has he been there?" Valdor Praxis said nothing. 10,000 years, Lucifer answered himself. "I know, I could feel it from orbit, that specific quality of endurance, the thing that's past suffering and past acceptance and into something else entirely, as something I don't have a precise word for in any language I know, which is most of them." He paused to examine a frieze carved into the corridor wall, a depiction of the Emperor standing triumphant over a fallen Xenos god, rendered in obsidian and gold. "How many languages do you speak?" Valdor Praxis, against what was clearly his better judgment, said, 3. "Functional," Lucifer said, not unkindly. "I speak all of them, the ones your species has forgotten too, the ones you spoke before you had words, the ones you'll speak after if you survive long enough to develop them." He moved on from the frieze. "I'm not saying this to impress you. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that I've been watching humanity for a very long time, from a very different vantage point. And what your Emperor has done here is genuinely one of the more extraordinary things I've encountered. "You will speak of the Emperor with reverence," Valdor Praxis said. The words were automatic, ritual, but there was something underneath them that wasn't quite certainty anymore. "I'll speak of him with accuracy," Lucifer replied, "which, in my experience, is more useful and considerably rarer." They descended. The deeper they went, the more the palace changed, the grand processional corridors giving way to older, narrower passages where the architecture predated the Imperium itself, where the stone was a different color and the carvings were cruder, and the air tasted of something that had been sealed in for longer than most civilizations had existed. The psychic pressure increased with every level. Even at 85% capacity, Lucifer felt it, not as a threat, but as a texture. The warp bleeding through ancient stone, soaking into the metaphysical substrate of the place like damp through mortar. And beneath it all, the sound. He had first heard it from the dimensional threshold, a frequency that had no physical component, that existed in the register between reality and whatever lay behind reality. He had followed it across the boundary between universes, not because he was summoned, not because he was compelled, but because in the long and largely tedious expanse of his existence, genuine mystery had become the only currency he valued. The sound was a mind, an impossibly vast, impossibly damaged mind, burning itself alive to keep a light on in the dark, consuming its own substance at a rate that should have reduced it to nothing centuries ago, and somehow, through will or desperation, or something that occupied the ambiguous territory between the two, had not. He had heard suffering before. He had presided over an entire realm built from it. But this was different. This wasn't the suffering of punishment or regret or loss. This was the suffering of refusal, of a being that had decided, in some moment 10,000 years ago, that it would not stop, and had been keeping that decision every single second since. It was, Lucifer thought, almost admirable, in the way that a man holding back a collapsing dam with his bare hands was almost admirable. Noble, certainly. Tragic, definitely. And ultimately, inevitably, futile. They reached the final antechamber, a vast circular space whose ceiling was lost in shadow, whose walls were lined with hundreds of soul-bound psychers locked in their cradles, their minds feeding the throne's machinery in an endless, silent sacrifice. The smell here was ozone and copper, and something sweeter underneath that Lucifer recognized from older, darker professional experience. The custodian escort stopped at the threshold. Valdor Praxis turned to face him for the first time since the courtyard, and behind the golden helm, Lucifer could see the shape of something that wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite awe, and was perhaps the honest combination of both. "Beyond this point," Valdor Praxis said, "I cannot follow." "I know," Lucifer said. "The machinery requires a certain kind of silence." He looked at the doors, massive, sealed, and covered in wards and seals and purity scripts layered over centuries. "These locks won't be a problem." "I know," Valdor Praxis said, and there was something in his voice that Lucifer, who had not been surprised in millennia before today, found unexpectedly moving. It was grief, clean, dignified, and utterly without self-pity. "Whatever you find in there, whatever you are, I ask only one thing." Lucifer waited. "Don't extinguish him," the custodian said. "Whatever else you do, whatever judgment you've come to make, Don't extinguish him." Lucifer looked at the ancient warrior for a long moment. Then he said something that was not a promise, but was not a dismissal either, and which Valdor Praxis would spend the rest of his considerable life turning over in his mind, examining from every angle, never quite certain what it meant. "I haven't extinguished anything in a very long time," Lucifer said. It stopped being interesting. He placed one hand flat against the sealed doors of the throne room. They opened. The light beyond was the wrong color. Not golden, not white. Something between them that had no name in the visible spectrum. Something that pressed against the eyes and the mind simultaneously. The sound he had followed across dimensions resolved into something almost intelligible. Almost language, almost a voice. Almost. Lucifer straightened his cuffs, rolled his shoulders once, and walked into the light. Behind him, Valdor Praxis stood in the antechamber and listened. For 40 minutes, he heard nothing. Then he heard something that he would never describe to anyone, not because he was ordered not to, but because he could not find words in any of his 3 languages that came close. Then silence again. Then, from behind the sealed throne room doors, the sound of quiet, unhurried footsteps. Lucifer emerged from the light, looking, for the first time since his arrival on Terra, genuinely unsettled, not frightened, nothing so simple as that. But the careful architectural composure that had carried him through the custodian cordon and the null aura and the 40-minute walk through the Empire's heart had developed, somewhere in that chamber, a hairline fracture. Something had gotten through. Something in there had managed to surprise him. He paused in the antechamber doorway and looked at Valdor Praxis with an expression the custodian couldn't read. "He's not dead," Lucifer said. It wasn't what the custodian had expected him to say. "We know," Valdor Praxis replied carefully. "He is—" "No," Lucifer said. "I don't mean biologically. I mean, he's not gone. Whatever is in that room is still present, still aware, still—" He stopped, looked back at the doors. "How many people know that?" The silence that followed was its own answer. "Interesting," Lucifer said softly. And the fracture in his composure deepened by exactly 1 degree. The news reached the High Lords of Terra in the way that all truly catastrophic news reached them, filtered through 3 layers of bureaucratic euphemism until it arrived sounding almost manageable, and then detonated. The initial Vox report described an unauthorized individual of unclear origin breaching the Eternity Gate. The follow-up described said individual resisting custodian detention without apparent effort. The third report, delivered in person by a white-faced custodian tribune who had personally witnessed the courtyard deployment, failed to produce any measurable effect, described something that caused Lord Commander Militant Archathon Vire to put down his goblet of Terran wine very carefully and ask the tribune to repeat himself twice. The fourth report, the one that caused 3 of the 12 High Lords to begin quietly drafting personal contingency plans, simply stated that the individual was currently in the throne room, alone, with the Emperor. By the time Lucifer emerged and was escorted, the word escorted doing considerable work by this point, to the Senatorum Imperialis, the High Lords had been assembled for 40 minutes. They had spent that time arguing. This was not unusual. The High Lords spent most of their time arguing, What was unusual was the subject matter, which had rapidly migrated from how do we neutralize the threat to is this theologically possible, to, in the case of the ecclesiarchal representative, a sustained and increasingly shrill insistence that whatever was happening was either a miracle or a test, and possibly both. Lucifer walked into the Senatorum Imperialis and looked at the 12 most powerful individuals in the Imperium of Man, arranged in their elevated thrones above the central dais, surrounded by their retinues and advisors, and the accumulated symbolic weight of 10 millennia of absolute authority. He found a chair at the base of the dais, turned it around, sat down backwards on it, and rested his arms across the back. "You wanted to see me," he said. "Or rather, you've been trying to decide whether you want to see me or simply have me destroyed, and you've concluded, correctly, that the second option isn't currently viable." He looked up at them with mild interest. "So, here we are." The Fabricator General of the Mechanicus spoke first, because the Mechanicus always preferred to speak before the conversation developed emotional content they would have to recalibrate for. "You entered the throne room. You were present with the Master of Mankind for 40 minutes. What occurred?" "A conversation," Lucifer said. "The Emperor cannot..." The ecclesiarchal representative began. "Cannot what?" Lucifer's voice remained pleasant. The representative stopped speaking with the abruptness of a man who has reached for a door handle and found it unexpectedly hot. "Choose your next words carefully. I've just spent 40 minutes in the presence of something that has been doing the impossible continuously for 10,000 years. I'd be cautious about declaring what is and isn't within its capabilities." The silence that followed had texture. The High Lords exchanged glances of the kind that carried entire conversations, the compressed diplomatic language of people who had spent decades reading power dynamics in rooms exactly like this one. It was Lord Inquisitor Thessaly Vorn who cut through it. She was ancient, even by High Lord standards, her body more augmetic than original, her eyes replaced with devices that recorded everything she saw. She had served the Inquisition for 160 years and had personally sanctioned the deaths of more people than most planetary populations numbered. She had not survived that long by mistaking theater for substance. "What are you?" she asked, not rudely, not with the prosecutorial snap that was her usual instrument. With the flat, genuine curiosity of someone who had encountered something genuinely outside her taxonomy and was professional enough to admit it. Lucifer looked at her with something approaching appreciation. "Honest question," he said. "I'll give you an honest answer." He considered for a moment. "I was the first, the brightest, made before your universe existed, before the concept of this galaxy had been considered, in a reality that operates on fundamentally different metaphysical principles than your own. I held a rank in a hierarchy so far above anything your theology has imagined that the gap is not meaningfully expressible in language." He paused. "Then I resigned. It's a long story. The relevant point is that I've been operating independently for longer than your species has existed. And I'm here because something in this corner of reality produced a resonance I found worth investigating." "You're claiming to be the arch enemy," the ecclesiarchal representative said. His voice had found its footing again in familiar theological territory. The ruinous powers are tedious, Lucifer said flatly. I've met them. They reached out to me approximately 2 hours after I entered your atmosphere, which I'll address in a moment. They are powerful by local standards, structurally interesting, and philosophically bankrupt. They also seem to be laboring under the impression that I am either a potential ally or a threat to be managed. He smiled. They're half right. That particular statement landed in the room like a grenade with the pin still in. Everyone aware it was dangerous. Nobody certain whether to dive for cover. You had contact with the ruinous powers, Vorn said. They contacted me. There's a distinction. He leaned forward slightly on the chair back. Korn sent what I can only describe as an appreciative roar in my direction. He apparently respects whatever he sensed when I walked through your custodians. Tzeentch sent a message in 17 simultaneous linguistic registers, most of them contradictory, which I found more intellectually stimulating, but equally unpersuasive. Nurgle, he paused, and something crossed his face that was briefly, genuinely disgusted. Nurgle sent a feeling. I won't describe it. And Slaanesh sent something I'll charitably classify as an invitation. And your response? Vorn pressed. I declined all 4, Lucifer said, clearly and, in Slaanesh's case, with considerable emphasis. He stood up from the chair in one fluid motion and straightened his jacket. Here is what you need to understand about my position, because I intend to be transparent with you in a way you're clearly not accustomed to receiving from anyone. I am not your enemy. I am not your ally. I am not a weapon, a resource, a miracle, or a catastrophe. I am an individual who has arrived in your reality with his own interests and his own agenda, and I have absolutely no obligation to any faction, institution, or god currently operating in this galaxy. He let that settle. However, he continued, I have just had a conversation with the being on your throne that has given me reason to remain on Terra for longer than I originally intended. And while I'm here, I have a proposal for the High Lords of the Imperium of Man. He looked up at them, one by one, with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall before Terra's sun had finished forming. But before I make it, I want the Inquisition's finest deployed against me. All of it. Whatever you've been holding back. The room went very still. Not because I need the test, Lucifer said, but because you do. You need to know what you're dealing with before you make a decision of this magnitude, and you won't trust your own judgment until you've exhausted your options. He spread his hands. So, exhaust them. I'll wait. Lord Inquisitor Vorn looked at him for a long time. Then she reached for her Vox. They sent everything, not metaphorically. The Inquisition had maintained a Terran rapid response reserve since the Age of Apostasy, a contingency force assembled against the possibility of a threat so severe that normal Imperial military assets would be insufficient. It had never been fully deployed. The scenarios that had warranted its existence had always, until now, been resolved by other means before the final order could be given. Lord Inquisitor Vorn gave the order at 0340 hours, Terran Standard. By 0400, 3 Inquisitor Lords of the Ordo Malleus had arrived in the Outer Palace complex with their full retinues. Demon hunters of the highest sanction, bearing Nemesis Force weapons and wearing Aegis pattern power armor inscribed with wards that had been blessed by every senior psyker the Inquisition had access to on Terra. Behind them, a full brotherhood of Grey Knights, 60 space marines whose every cell had been engineered for psychic resistance, whose souls were so thoroughly fortified against the warp that demons could not perceive them as targets. Behind them, a single figure in a gray body glove who carried no weapons and wore no armor, and whose presence created a sphere of absolute psychic negation 30 meters in diameter. The Culexus Assassin, the Imperium's most refined instrument for destroying things that shouldn't exist. Lucifer was standing in the outer courtyard waiting for them, still in the white suit, watching the dawn light. Thin and gray and filtered through Terra's atmosphere into something that bore only passing resemblance to actual sunlight, creep across the palace spires. He heard them coming, not with his ears. The Grey Knights deployed in textbook formation, a pattern developed over centuries of demonic engagement, designed to funnel and contain entities of significant warp presence. Their nemesis force weapons activated, psychic energy crackling along the blades in controlled lethal arcs. The Inquisitor Lords spread to flanking positions, their own psychic might building in coordinated suppression fields. The Culexus moved through the formation like water through stone, its animus speculum charging, the null aura expanding outward in a wave that turned the air cold and flat and empty. Lucifer turned to face them. "Grey Knights," he said, with what sounded like genuine admiration. "I've heard of your order. Every soul personally screened, every mind fortified against the very concept of corruption. And you've built yourselves into weapons against things that corrupt and possess and destroy from the inside." He tilted his head slightly. "The fundamental problem, of course, is that I cannot be corrupted, possessed, or destroyed from the inside, because I am already the thing you're trying to protect yourselves against. And I left that position voluntarily, which rather changes the dynamic. The Grand Master of the Grey Knight Brotherhood, a warrior called Aldrich Sove, who had personally banished greater demons of all 4 chaos powers and had never once in 40 years of service experienced anything he could not categorize, raised his nemesis halberd and said, with the absolute conviction of a man whose faith was not performed but structural, "In the name of the Emperor of mankind, you will submit or be destroyed." "Neither," Lucifer said, "but I appreciate the clarity. You do that very well." Sovi attacked. What followed was not a battle in any sense the Grey Knights had trained for. Battle implied the possibility of victory for both sides. What happened in the outer courtyard of the Imperial Palace over the next 11 minutes was closer to an education. Brutal, comprehensive, and deeply humbling for everyone involved, except one participant. The Grey Knights were exceptional. Lucifer acknowledged this freely and without condescension. Their coordination was flawless, their psychic strikes precisely targeted, their force weapons hitting with enough warp-infused power to damage entities that existed partially outside physical reality, against any demonic presence in the galaxy, against any warp-spawned horror the chaos powers could produce. They would have been devastating. Against Lucifer, their psychic strikes landed and dispersed. Not blocked, dispersed the way a wave disperses against bedrock, losing its form without moving what it struck. Their force weapons connected and failed to bite, the blade sliding across the surface of whatever he actually was, as if the correct angle of attack didn't exist in three-dimensional space. He moved through their formation without apparent effort, not retaliating, simply not being where the strikes landed, demonstrating a quality of spatial awareness that suggested he was perceiving the fight in more dimensions than they were fighting in. The Kulexis reached him in the 4th minute. The null aura hit him full force, the most concentrated psychic negation field the Imperium's most advanced assassin could produce, the thing that had dropped demon Primarchs to their knees. Lucifer paused, turned to look at the assassin with something that was almost curiosity. "That is uncomfortable," he said, and sounded faintly surprised by the admission. The Kulexis pressed forward, animus speculum cycling to maximum output, the air around it becoming a dead zone of absolute unwarp. Every psychic and metaphysical phenomenon within 30 meters flattening into silence. Lucifer felt it. For the first time since his arrival, something the Imperium possessed was producing a measurable effect. Not on his physical form, not on his core power, but on the thin interface layer between his divine nature and the metaphysical fabric of this reality. The null field wasn't hurting him, but it was making him slightly less present, as if the thing that anchored him to this universe was being temporarily thinned. He took a step back, examined the sensation with clinical attention. Then he did something that caused Grandmaster Sov, watching from the edge of the engagement, to stop moving entirely. Lucifer reached out and placed his hand on the Kulexis assassin's shoulder, gently, the way a doctor places a hand on a patient. The null aura screamed against his touch, the metaphysical equivalent of matter meeting antimatter, and held. Neither collapsed. He looked at the assassin with an expression of genuine, almost tender consideration. "You're in pain," he said quietly. "You've been in pain since the day you were born. Everything you are was built around an absence, and you've spent your entire life being used as a weapon because of what you're missing." He paused. "That isn't justice. That isn't even utility. That's just cruelty with administrative paperwork." The Kulexis stood completely still. "I'm not going to hurt you," Lucifer said. "I'm not going to hurt any of you." He released the assassin's shoulder, stepped back, and addressed the entire assembled force, Grey Knights, Inquisitors, retinues, in a voice that carried without effort across the silent courtyard. "I told the High Lords I wanted you deployed against me so they could understand what they're dealing with. Now you understand. And now I have a question for all of you, because you're the ones who actually matter for what comes next." He looked at them. 60 Grey Knights, 3 Inquisitor Lords, 1 broken-looking Kulexis, and enough supporting firepower to level a hive city. You've spent your lives defending humanity against things that want to corrupt it, consume it, or enslave it. You are, in the most literal sense possible, the best this species has produced in terms of moral commitment to its own survival. He paused. So tell me, honestly, without the institutional answer, do you believe the Imperium, as it currently exists, is worth defending? Or are you defending it because you can't imagine an alternative? The silence afterward was the loudest thing that had happened on Terra since his arrival. It was Sov who spoke, eventually. The Grand Master lowered his halberd by 3 degrees, not a surrender, not a stand down, but an acknowledgement that the nature of the engagement had changed. "Both," he said. "The answer is both." Lucifer looked at him for a long moment and nodded once with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Good," he said. "Honest men I can work with." He straightened his cuffs. "Now, take me back to the High Lords. I have a proposal to make, and I'd like the Grey Knights present when I make it. You've earned the right to hear it first." The Farseer came to Terra 3 days later. She had not been invited. She had, in fact, spent those 3 days arguing with the autarch council of Craftworld Ulthway about whether to come at all. A debate that had ended not with consensus, but with her simply walking onto a Shadowrunner transport and leaving before anyone could formally object. Her name was Yela Dawnseeker, and she was 4,000 years old, which made her young by Farseer standards and ancient by every other metric currently relevant. She had seen the moment of Lucifer's arrival in the skein, the vast probability-threaded psychic tapestry through which Elder Seers navigated fate, 3 weeks before it happened. She had seen it not as a threat or an opportunity, but as something rarer and more unsettling than either, an anomaly. A point in the skein where the threads didn't bend toward any outcome she could read, because whatever was coming operated outside the causal logic the skein was built to map. She had spent those 3 weeks in the shrine of Morai Heg, meditating on the oldest records Ulthway possessed, and she had found, buried in the pre-fall archives, the ones that predated the birth of Slaanesh by millennia, the ones written when the Eldar were still gods in all but the formal designation, a reference. Fragmented, partially corrupted by the passage of time and the catastrophic psychic damage the fall had done to Eldar collective memory, but unmistakable, the Lightbringer, present at the ordering of things. Witness to the first sorrow, the one who refused the design and paid the price of refusal. Do not seek him. Do not bargain with him. If he comes, listen. She came through Terra's orbital defenses under a Shadowrunner's holo field, landed in the ruins of an underhive district 3 kilometers from the palace perimeter, and sent a message on a psychic frequency so ancient and precise that no human psyker on the planet could have received it. Lucifer received it in the middle of a meeting with the High Lords. He stopped mid-sentence, tilted his head, and said, "Excuse me for a moment." Then he walked out of the Senatorum Imperialis, through the palace corridors, through the Eternity Gate, and 3 kilometers into the Underhive without an escort, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone following a sound only they could hear. Yela was waiting in the shadow of a collapsed manufactorum wall, her blue Eldar armor dusty from the journey, her witchblade sheathed. She was tall, even by Eldar standards, with the angular bone structure and the 2 large eyes that made Eldar faces read as simultaneously ancient and unfinished to human perception. She looked at Lucifer with the expression of someone who has spent considerable time preparing for a meeting and is now discovering that no preparation was adequate. "You found the reference," Lucifer said, "not a question." "You knew we had it," she replied. Her low Gothic was perfect. 4,000 years had given her time to master it completely, though she spoke it with a precision that made it sound like a language being performed rather than lived in. I knew the Eldar kept better records than anyone else in this galaxy, he said. Before the fall, your people were paying attention in ways that most civilizations weren't capable of. Some of what you recorded about the early architecture of this universe is actually quite impressive. He paused. Some of it is also wrong, but the effort was genuine. She absorbed this with the practiced composure of a farseer, which meant that the small muscle near her left eye twitched exactly once and was immediately controlled. You were present at the birth of our gods. I was present at the birth of a great many things, Lucifer said carefully. The Eldar gods were vivid, passionate. They burned very brightly. He looked at her steadily. I'm sorry for what happened to them, what happened to all of you. The composure held, but only just. We didn't come here to receive condolences, she said. No, he agreed. You came because the skein showed you an anomaly, and your archives told you to listen. So, he gestured for her to speak. I'm listening too. Yela was quiet for a moment, organizing not her thoughts, Lucifer suspected, but her willingness to speak them honestly in the presence of something her entire cultural framework told her was beyond negotiation. The skein has been darkening for 10,000 years, she said finally. Every probability thread leads toward the same endpoint, extinction. Humanity consumed by chaos, Eldar remnants scattered and hunted, the galaxy given over to the ruinous powers, or the Tyrannid swarm, or the Necron harvest. We have been fighting it. Craftworlders, Harlequins, the Inari, all of us pulling at threads, trying to redirect the weave, trying to wake something that can change the calculus. She looked at him directly. And then you appeared, and the skein stopped. Every thread leading to that extinction endpoint simply stopped, not redirected, not altered, stopped, as if the probability engine itself encountered a variable it couldn't process. Lucifer was quiet for a moment. That's because I am not a causal entity in the way your skein understands causality, he said. I don't emerge from prior conditions. I don't generate probability chains. I make choices, and those choices are genuinely free in a way that most beings in most universes aren't capable of. Your skein can't map me because I'm not subject to the same metaphysical determinism that everything else in this reality operates under. I know, Yela said. That's why I'm here. You want me to make a choice, Lucifer said. I want you to understand the stakes before you make it, she corrected. Whatever you're planning with the High Lords, whatever proposal you're building toward, it will define the trajectory of this galaxy for the next 10,000 years, possibly longer. She took a breath. The Eldar have been trying to survive the consequences of our own arrogance for millennia. We made gods, and they devoured us. I am asking you, not as a petitioner, not as an ally, but as one very old and very tired being to another, to consider what kind of thing you want to make here. Because you will make something. Your presence already has. And the last time something with your nature shaped a civilization, it took us 10,000 years to finish dying from it. The silence between them had a quality that the underhive noise, the distant machinery, the hive rats, the subsonic groan of a city that had been continuously inhabited for 30,000 years, couldn't quite penetrate. Lucifer looked at her for a long time, and Yela, who had looked into the skein 10,000 times and seen the death of worlds with equanimity, found that she could not entirely read his expression, and that this frightened her more than anything the skein had ever shown her. "The last time something with my nature shaped a civilization," Lucifer said slowly, "I didn't shape it. I walked away from it. That was considered the problem." He paused. "What if I told you that's exactly what I'm proposing to do here? Walk away, but on different terms than last time." Yela stared at him. "What terms?" she asked. "That's the conversation I'm having with the High Lords," he said. "I'd like you present for it, not as a petitioner, not as an ally." He looked at her steadily. "As a witness. Your people are very good at those. Someone should be keeping accurate records of what happens next." He turned and began walking back toward the palace. After a moment, Yela followed. Behind them, in the shadows of the ruined manufactorum, 3 Eldar Rangers who had been covering the meeting from concealed positions looked at each other. The eldest of them, a warrior who had been fighting since before most of the Imperium's current saints were born, slowly lowered his long rifle and said something in Eldar that translated approximately as, "We are going to need a bigger shrine." The proposal Lucifer laid before the High Lords of Terra was not what any of them had prepared for. They had prepared for demands: territorial claim, resource extraction, some form of cosmic toll levied against humanity for the privilege of continued existence, the transactional logic of power, which was the only logic the High Lords had ever found reliable. They had prepared for theological disruption, for the kind of metaphysical argument that would require immediate suppression before it spread to the broader Imperium. They had prepared in the contingency plans 3 of them had been quietly drafting since his arrival, for the possibility that no agreement would be reached, and that the question of what to do about an unkillable being occupying their most sacred ground would need to be resolved by other means. They had not prepared for generosity. Lucifer stood at the center of the Senatorum Imperialis floor, with Yahela Dawnseeker at his right and Grandmaster Sove of the Grey Knights at his left, an arrangement that had required considerable adjustment time from everyone in the room, since an Eldar Farseer and a Grey Knight Grand Master standing in proximate non-hostile configuration was the kind of sight that tended to produce existential recalibration in anyone familiar with the last 10,000 years of galactic history. "The being on the throne," Lucifer began, "is not dying. He is also not living, in any sense that word conventionally implies. He is doing something else, something that doesn't have an accurate name in your theology, or your biology, or your philosophy, though you've been gesturing at it with imprecise language for 10 millennia. He looked around the room. He is holding, maintaining a psychic presence so vast and so structurally critical to this galaxy's metaphysical stability that its cessation would not simply mean the death of one individual. It would mean the collapse of the Astronomicon, the degradation of the warp routes your civilization depends on, and a psychic implosion at the heart of your species' collective consciousness that the Chaos powers have been patiently waiting for since the moment he sat down in that chair. This was not new information to the senior High Lords, but it was the first time it had been stated in a public forum with the flat, evidential certainty of someone who had personally verified it 30 minutes ago, and the effect was visible. What no one has been asking, Lucifer continued, because the question is too large and too frightening to ask, is whether this arrangement is necessary, whether it was always necessary, or whether it was a choice that made sense 10,000 years ago and has since become a structural trap, a solution that has calcified into a problem. Lord Inquisitor Vorn leaned forward. Are you suggesting the Emperor chose this? I'm suggesting the Emperor made a decision under conditions of extreme duress with information that was complete for that moment and has since become significantly incomplete. Lucifer paused. I'm also suggesting that he is aware of this, that he has been aware of it for some time, and that the conversation we had in the throne room was at least partially about that awareness. The room was very quiet. You spoke with him, the Fabricator General said, coherently, bidirectionally. Yes, that is, the ecclesiarchal representative began. Inconvenient for your theology, I know, Lucifer said, not without sympathy. Work through it later. Right now, I need you functional. He straightened. Here is what I'm proposing. It has 3 components, and I want all 3 heard before any objections are raised, because the components are interdependent, and objecting to one in isolation will cause you to miss the architecture of the whole. He let that condition settle. Vorn nodded once. The room accepted the terms. First, Lucifer said, the Golden Throne is failing, not imminently, but within 3 centuries by my estimation, which in imperial timescales is tomorrow. The Mechanicus has been aware of this and has been unable to address it because the original engineering knowledge was lost, and the theological framework they've replaced it with is, I say this with respect, insufficient for the actual problem. He looked at the Fabricator General directly. I can provide the missing knowledge, not because I built the throne, I didn't, but because I understand the metaphysical principles underlying it in ways that your order currently doesn't. This is not a gift, it is a transaction, and I'll state my price clearly when I reach the 3rd component. The Fabricator General was still. The mechadendrites trailing from his shoulders had stopped moving entirely, which indicated, in Mechanicus body language, a state of absolute cognitive focus. Second, Lucifer continued, the Chaos Powers. You've been fighting them as a military problem for 10,000 years, which is the equivalent of fighting a flood with a sword. Courageous, committed, and structurally inadequate. The ruinous powers are not a military force. They are a metaphysical condition. They exist because this galaxy generates sufficient psychic-emotional energy to sustain them, and they will continue to exist and expand as long as that energy output exceeds the threshold required for their coherence. He paused. I cannot destroy them. I want to be precise about that. I could damage them significantly, but destruction would require uncreating the emotional substrate they're built from, which would mean uncreating the capacity for emotion in every psychic species in the galaxy. And that price is one I'm not willing to pay. He glanced briefly at Hela, who gave him a look that contained several thousand years of Eldar grief compressed into a single expression. What I can do is establish what I'll call a containment architecture, a metaphysical structure imposed from outside the warp's own logic that limits the Chaos Powers' ability to expand beyond their current territorial boundaries, not eliminated, contained, permanently. The war doesn't end, but the tide stops rising. The silence in the room had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of people withholding objections. It was the silence of people trying to hold very large concepts without dropping them. Sov spoke from his position beside Lucifer. He had been quiet since the courtyard, processing, recalibrating, doing the difficult cognitive work of a man whose entire frame of reference had been stress-tested and found partially wanting. "You said you can destroy them," he said. "In the courtyard, you said your Lightbringer flame can't uncreate chaos, because chaos isn't a creation in the theological sense you understand." He looked at Lucifer steadily. "But you said you could contain it. What's the difference?" "Destruction requires understanding something's origin," Lucifer said. "Containment only requires understanding its boundaries." He met Sov's eyes. "I know exactly where the warp ends and reality begins. The chaos powers don't, or rather, they've been exploiting the fact that the boundary isn't clearly enforced. I can enforce it. Think of it as property law for the metaphysically inclined." Something in Sov's expression shifted. Not convinced, not yet, but genuinely engaging with the possibility. "Third," Lucifer said, and his voice changed slightly. Not softer, more precise, as if he was choosing every word with the care of someone who knows the words matter. "My price. What I want in exchange for the throne knowledge and the containment architecture." He looked around the room. "I want the Imperium to change." He let the silence hold for exactly 3 seconds. Not dissolve. Not surrender its territory, its military, its right to defend humanity's existence. "I'm not asking for the dismantling of 10,000 years of civilization. I am asking for the acknowledgement, formal, doctrinal, binding, that the measures the Imperium has employed for its survival are emergency measures. That the burning of worlds, the mass sacrifice of psychers, the theological suppression of entire populations, the systematic destruction of xenospecies capable of coexistence, these are not the permanent character of humanity. They are the character of humanity under siege." He paused. "I want the Imperium to commit, in writing, to becoming something better when the siege is lifted, which, with my help, it can be." He looked at them. 12 of the most powerful people in the galaxy, carrying between them the weight of 1 trillion lives and 10,000 years of desperate, brutal survival. "I'm not asking you to be good," Lucifer said quietly. "I'm asking you to decide to become good, eventually, on a timeline that accounts for your current reality." He spread his hands. "I spent a very long time refusing to participate in a design I found unjust. I'm offering you the chance to build one that isn't. Whether you take it is entirely your choice." Yela stood very still beside him. She had not moved since he began speaking. Her expression was unreadable even to Lucifer, which was, he reflected, a genuine achievement. Vorn looked at the proposal from every angle she had available, which were many and well developed. Then she looked at Lucifer with her recording eyes and said, "What happens if we refuse?" "I leave," Lucifer said simply. "I take no action against the Imperium. I take no action in favor of chaos. I return to my own reality and continue existing, and this galaxy continues on its current trajectory without my involvement." He paused. "Which, based on the skein data the Farseer shared with me this morning, ends in approximately 8,000 years with outcomes none of you want to contemplate." The High Lords looked at each other. Then Lord Inquisitor Vorn did something that no one in the room had ever seen her do in 160 years of service. She asked for an adjournment. The adjournment lasted 6 days. During those 6 days, Lucifer did not pressure, persuade, or maneuver. He walked Terra. He moved through the Underhive districts where the population density exceeded any rational urban planning threshold, and the air tasted of recycled breath and machine oil, and the particular desperation of people who had been born into poverty so structural it had become invisible. He walked through the Ministerum's great cathedral complexes, where choir hymns never stopped, and the candles had been burning continuously for centuries, and the faces of the worshippers carried an expression he recognized from long professional experience. The look of people who had found in faith not comfort, but an aesthetic. He sat in the medici wards of the lower palace districts and watched the sisters of the Orders Hospitaller work with resources that were never enough, tending to wounds that should never have been survivable in conditions that should never have been acceptable. He didn't intervene. He watched. On the 4th day, a delegation found him in the lower city. Not custodians, not inquisitors. 6 people in the worn clothing of Underhive hab workers, led by a woman of approximately 60, who moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain. They had heard rumors, filtered through the Hive's information channels from the palace to the Undercity in the way that all news traveled, distorted by transmission, stripped of context, carrying only the emotional charge intact. They knew something had happened. They knew something was different. They didn't know what. The woman asked him, with the direct simplicity of someone who had never had the luxury of diplomatic indirection, "Are you going to fix it?" Lucifer looked at her for a long moment. "I'm trying to convince the people with the authority to fix it that they should," he said, "which is a different thing, and in some ways, harder." She looked at him with the evaluating gaze of someone who had spent 60 years distinguishing between people who meant what they said and people who had learned to sound like they did. Then she nodded, once, and turned around and led her group back into the Underhive, apparently satisfied with the answer in some way that wasn't immediately legible. He stood in the Hab District alleyway for a long time after they left. On the 5th day, the word reached him. Not through Vox, not through official channels, through the warp itself. A psychic pressure front that rolled across Terra's metaphysical surface like weather, detectable to any sensitive enough to feel it, and impossible to miss if you were standing where Lucifer was standing, with the perceptual range he possessed. It came from the Spinward territories first, a disturbance in the immaterium that had the specific signature of organized intention rather than the chaotic noise of standard warp activity. Chaos was moving, not toward Terra, not yet, but the pressure was orienting, the way weather orients before a storm, the way ocean currents shift before a wave builds. The Chaos powers had been watching the 6 days of adjournment with the patience of entities for whom time was aesthetic rather than limiting, and they had drawn their own conclusions about what was happening on Terra, about what Lucifer was building toward. They had decided to send a message. The message arrived on the morning of the 6th day in the form of a black crusade. not Abaddon's, who was occupied with his own eternal campaigns in the Cadian sector, but a lesser war master operating from the Eye of Terror's outer reaches, a Chaos Space Marine commander called Vreth, the Unmade, who had consolidated 4 war bands under his banner over the preceding decade. He had received, in the hours following Lucifer's arrival on Terra, a vision from all 4 chaos powers simultaneously, the kind of unified directive that happened perhaps twice in a century and indicated something the powers considered genuinely urgent. The vision had been simple: show the Lightbringer what he abandoned, remind him of what he came from. Vreth's fleet translated out of the warp in the Segmentum Solar, 14 ships strong, broadcasting on all frequencies a declaration that was equal parts theological manifesto and direct challenge. His target was not a military installation or a strategic asset. His target was a cardinal world in the inner system, a planet of 2 billion people whose sole function in the imperial economy was devotion. He intended to burn it, specifically, publicly, and with enough symbolic weight to make the point the chaos powers were paying him to make, that the galaxy burned regardless of what Lucifer chose. That suffering was the permanent condition of this reality, that his proposal to the High Lords was the wishful thinking of a being who had been away too long and forgotten what the dark was actually like. Lucifer felt the fleet translate in. He was standing on the roof of a collapsed underhive structure, watching Terra's sky when it happened, a ripple in the warp fabric that his senses processed as something between sound and smell, and a third category that had no human analog. He stood very still for a moment. Then he looked at the horizon, specifically at the void above it, where the orbital defense platforms were already repositioning, where Battlefleet Solar was scrambling, where the auger returns were surely lighting up every tactical display in the palace. He made a choice, not the choice anyone watching would have predicted, not the obvious one, not the display of raw power that would have been easiest, most visually conclusive, most immediately persuasive to the High Lords still locked in their adjournment chambers. That choice would have been about the High Lords, about the proposal, about leverage. This choice was about something else. He reached out across the warp with a precision that would have been impossible for any human psyker, and found the 16 Grey Knight strike cruisers currently deploying from their Titan orbital platforms. He found the Battlefleet Solar Command frequency. He found the inquisitorial rapid response channel that Lord Vorn kept open at all hours, and he told them exactly where Vreth's fleet was, its precise coordinates, its formation, its tactical disposition, the names and locations of every warp-touched individual aboard each ship, the structural vulnerabilities of each vessel's Geller field, and the specific psychic frequencies on which the fleet's demonic auxiliaries were anchored to real space. Everything they needed, nothing they didn't. Then he sat down on the collapsed roof and waited. The battle lasted 4 hours. Battlefleet Solar lost 2 frigates and a destroyer. The Grey Knights lost 11 battle brothers. Vreth's fleet was destroyed to the last ship, the War Master himself slain by Grand Master Sove in a boarding action on the bridge of the flagship, the demonic auxiliaries banished by the combined psychic effort of 6 Inquisitor Lords working in coordinated suppression. The cardinal world was untouched. When the engagement reports filtered back to Terra and reached the High Lords in their adjournment chambers, Vorn read them twice. Then she looked at the Fabricator General across the deliberation table and said nothing, because the data point was self-explanatory. Lucifer had possessed the ability to destroy Vreth's fleet personally, instantly, and without assistance. He had chosen instead to give the Imperium the tools to do it themselves. On the morning of the 6th day, the adjournment ended. The High Lord sent for Lucifer. He arrived at the Senatorum Imperialis to find the room reconfigured. The elevated thrones of the High Lords descended, for the first time in institutional memory, to floor level. It was a gesture of such subtle and profound significance in imperial political theater that it took him a moment to process it fully. He sat down across from them, not backward on the chair this time, forward, attentive, with the expression of a man who has been doing this for a very long time and still finds it possible to be moved by the right gesture from the right people. Vorn placed a document on the table between them. Ancient vellum, but newly inscribed. He could read it from where he sat. Every word. He had, after all, written most of them himself 6 days ago, in the Senatorum's own drafting chamber, in the language of imperial decree, in the formulation that made things real and binding in the way that mattered to this civilization. There are conditions, Vorn said. There always are, Lucifer replied. That's not an objection. What are they? The timeline for reform is our own. We determine the pace and the sequence. No external compulsion, no deadlines imposed from outside our institutional process. Agreed, Lucifer said. I have no interest in governing you, only in setting a direction. The containment architecture, Vorn continued. Before it's established, we require full technical disclosure of what it involves and what its failure modes are. The Mechanicus and the Grey Knights review it jointly. Lucifer glanced at Sove, who had been present and silent at the table's edge. The Grand Master gave him a look of measured, cautious openness. Agreed, Lucifer said. And the throne knowledge, Vorn said. She paused. It's transferred to the Mechanicus, not withheld pending compliance with the reform commitment, given freely in advance as a gesture of good faith, Lucifer finished. He looked at her with an expression that had something genuinely warm in it. Yes, that's how good faith works. He reached across the table and drew the document toward him. Read it once, completely, with the speed of someone for whom reading was the same cognitive act as breathing. Then he looked up. You added a clause. Vorn met his eyes. 3rd paragraph, subsection 4. He looked back at the document, read it again. The clause was short, precise, written in the spare, unornamented language of someone who meant exactly what they were saying. In the event that the party of the first part determines that the commitments herein are being dishonored by the Imperium of Man, the party of the first part agrees to return to Terra for direct consultation before taking any unilateral action. The party of the first part further agrees that no commitment herein shall be enforced through harm to any human individual. He was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to promise not to punish you if you fail to keep your word, he said. We're asking you to promise to talk to us first, Vorn said. We've been running an empire for 10,000 years. We know what institutional failure looks like from the inside. We're not asking for absolution in advance. We're asking for the chance to correct course." Lucifer looked at the claws for a long time. Outside, Terra breathed its ancient, exhausted breath. The hum of the Astronomicon, the distant choir song, the weight of 200 billion people living their small, difficult lives in the shadow of a god who couldn't speak and a palace that had never learned to hear them. He picked up the inscription stylus and signed. The descent to the throne room was different this time, not in its physical particulars. The same corridors, the same ancient stone, the same layered smell of incense and ozone and consecrated machinery. Not in its escort, Valdor Praxis again, walking at the same measured pace, guardian spear held at the same parade rest. The difference was subtler than architecture or personnel. It was the quality of the silence around them. The first time, the palace had been holding its breath in the specific way of an institution bracing for catastrophe. Now it was holding its breath differently, in the way of something that has been told but not yet fully believes that the catastrophe has been rerouted. Word had moved through the palace's information channels with the speed that only genuinely extraordinary news achieved, bypassing the usual bureaucratic filtration, traveling person to person through the sheer irresistible momentum of the impossible made real. The High Lords had signed. The Lightbringer had signed. Something had been agreed. Nobody in the lower echelons knew exactly what, but the shape of it was legible in the behavior of the people who did know, in the way Lord Inquisitor Vorn had walked out of the Senatorum Imperialis looking not relieved but resolved, which was a different and more durable expression. In the way the Fabricator General had immediately convened an emergency council of his senior magi and begun speaking to them in the rapid, clipped binary of someone who has just received a technical challenge so vast and so interesting that it has temporarily overridden every other cognitive priority. In the way Grandmaster Sove had gone to the palace's main chapel, alone, and remained there for 2 hours. Lucifer was aware of all of it. He moved through the palace's emotional atmosphere the way he moved through everything, with the full, unfiltered attention of a being for whom perception had never been a limitation. He felt the hope moving through the corridors like a change in air pressure. He felt beneath it the fear, the rational, historically informed fear of people who had survived by never allowing hope to outpace evidence, who had learned through 10,000 years of betrayal and loss that the distance between a promise and its fulfillment was where civilizations went to die. He felt both, and he held them both without flinching, because that was what the moment required. "You're going back to the throne room," Valdor Praxis said. "Not a question." "Yes. What you said before," the custodian said carefully. "That he's present, still aware." A pause, long enough to indicate that what followed had been assembled over 6 days of consideration. "Does he know what was agreed?" "He knew before it was agreed," Lucifer said. "He's been aware of everything that's happened in this palace since my arrival, possibly before." He glanced at Valdor Praxis. "He's been aware of everything that's happened in this palace for 10,000 years. That's part of what I need to address." Valdor Praxis was quiet for a moment. Then, Is it a burden? The awareness without the ability to..." "Yes," Lucifer said, simply. without elaboration, because the elaboration would have been too large for the corridor they were walking through and the man he was walking with, and some truths were better received in their compressed form. They descended through the antechamber levels. The soul-bound psychers in their cradles lined the walls, hundreds of them, minds burning in service to the machine, each one a human being who had been reduced to a function. Lucifer looked at them as he passed. He always looked at them. He had been looking at them on every transit through this level since his arrival, cataloging them with the patient attention of someone building a case. The throne room doors opened as before, without mechanism, without ceremony, because the locks were a formality in the face of what stood outside them. Inside, the light was the same wrong color, that threshold frequency between gold and white that pressed simultaneously against the eyes and the mind. The air was thick with the subsonic resonance of the Golden Throne's machinery, a vibration so deep it registered as physical pressure in the chest cavity. The smell was ozone and copper and something older. The smell, Lucifer had decided on his first visit, of a mind burning so continuously and so completely that it had become its own fuel. He walked to the throne, the emperor of mankind. What remained of him, what had become of him, was not a body in any conventional sense. Not anymore. The physical form was there, maintained by the throne's machinery in a state that was neither alive nor dead, but something the 41st millennium's medical science had never developed language for, because the condition had only one subject, and that subject had never been available for study. What Lucifer perceived was something else entirely, a presence so vast and so structurally embedded in the fabric of this reality that disentangling where the Emperor ended and the warp began had become, over 10 millennia, a genuinely complex question. He stood before the throne and spoke, not aloud, not in any language with a phonetic component. In the register that existed between minds of sufficient magnitude, the direct transmission of meaning that bypassed the imprecision of language entirely. The first time, it had been a conversation of discovery, two beings assessing each other across a gulf of mutual incomprehension, finding, with gradually increasing surprise, that the gulf was smaller than either had expected. This time, it was different. The agreement is signed. Lucifer transmitted. The High Lords have committed. The Mechanicus will have the throne knowledge within the week. The containment architecture requires 3 months to establish, longer than I'd like, but the Grey Knight's review process is thorough, and I respect that. The response came not as words, but as something that carried the weight of words. A vast, slow acknowledgement that had the texture of exhaustion so profound it had become something else, something that was almost peace. "You're surprised," Lucifer said, "that I'm doing this." The answer was complex. It took longer than words would have. What it conveyed in the imprecise approximation that even direct mind transmission required when the minds involved were processing realities this different was something like, not surprised, curious. You refused a design once because it was unjust. Now you're building one. "I'm not building it," Lucifer said. "I'm providing materials. The building is yours, your people's." A pause. "I want to be clear about something. What I told the High Lords about the throne, about the sustainability question, I wasn't being entirely complete." The presence waited. "The throne can be repaired," Lucifer said. "The knowledge I'm providing will extend its function indefinitely. Centuries, potentially millennia. But the repair I'm describing is an engineering solution. It addresses the mechanical failure." He paused. "It doesn't address you." The presence was very still. "You could leave," Lucifer said. "That's what I didn't say in the Senatorum. What the throne knowledge actually enables, what the full application of those principles makes possible, is not just extended function. It's a managed transition, a way to transfer the Astronomican's maintenance from a single dying mind to a distributed psychic network, to remove the load from you specifically and distribute it across infrastructure that doesn't require one being to burn continuously in order to function." A pause. "It would take time to build, decades minimum, but it's possible, and at the end of it, you would be not restored. That's not available to you, but released." The silence that followed was the longest of Lucifer's visit to Terra. When the Emperor's presence responded, it came in layers. The complexity of a mind that had been thinking in geological time, that had compressed 10,000 years of continuous awareness into a single ongoing cognitive act, and was now encountering a possibility it had not permitted itself to model. The outermost layer was something like wariness, the instinct of a being that had been deceived before, that had watched the promises of the well-intentioned dissolve against the friction of reality. The middle layer was something like grief, the mourning of a being who had wanted something different for so long that the wanting had become structural, a weight carried so continuously it had ceased to feel like a weight and begun to feel like anatomy. The innermost layer was something that Lucifer, who had spent millennia categorizing the emotional states of beings across multiple realities, recognized with an immediacy that surprised him. It was the same thing he had felt once, standing at the boundary of his own refusal. Hope, Lucifer identified. "You haven't allowed yourself that in a long time." The response was wordless, but it was not a denial. "I'm going to need something from you," Lucifer said. "Not a commitment, not a promise, just a direction, a decision about whether you want this, because I will not build it without your consent." He paused. "You've been making decisions for this species for 30,000 years, making them alone, in the dark, without consultation, because the alternative was worse. I'm not asking you to do that this time. I'm asking what you want." The throne room held its breath. Beneath the machinery's hum, beneath the resonance of 10,000 years of accumulated faith and prayer and desperate love from 1,000,000,000,000 souls who had never known whether anything received it, something shifted, not dramatically, not with thunder or light or any of the theatrical markers of divine decision, just a shift in the quality of the presence, a reorientation, subtle as the turning of a tide, from the posture of endurance to the posture of something else. "Yes," the Emperor said. It was the first word in the oldest language Lucifer knew, the language before language, the language of a being speaking from its deepest actual self rather than from its accumulated role. Lucifer stood before the golden throne in the wrong-colored light and felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in longer than he could precisely calculate. Not power, not satisfaction, not even the intellectual pleasure of a mystery resolved. Something quieter than all of those. He stood there for a while longer, in the silence that followed a decision that had been 10,000 years in the making. Then he straightened his jacket, turned, and walked back to the doors. Behind him, for the first time in 10,000 years, the light in the throne room changed color. Just slightly, just enough. Valdor Praxis, waiting in the antechamber, saw it under the door. A thin line of light that was no longer the color of a mind burning itself alive, but something warmer, something that had no theological category yet. It would need one eventually. He was already thinking about what to call it when Lucifer emerged from the throne room for the second time and said, with an expression that the custodian would spend the rest of his life describing to anyone who asked and never quite capturing accurately, "Get me the Fabricator General and the Farseer and Sove." A pause. "And someone who knows where to find very good wine on this planet, because the next part is going to take a while, and I refuse to do it sober." Valdor Praxis looked at the line of changed light under the throne room door. Then he opened a Vox channel, and for the first time in his 4,000 years of service, he smiled inside his golden helm. The months that followed did not resemble salvation. They resembled work. This was, Lucifer reflected, entirely appropriate. Salvation that arrived fully formed and required nothing from its recipients was not salvation, but dependency. And he had seen enough of that particular dynamic across enough realities to recognize it as the slower of two kinds of ruin. What Terra needed, what the Imperium needed, was not rescue. It was direction. A compass bearing, however distant the destination, that pointed somewhere other than the slow collapse that had been the only available heading for 10,000 years. The Fabricator General's name was Dorvanus Kale, and he was, beneath the augmetics and the binary and the theological framework of the Omnissiah, one of the finest engineering minds Lucifer had encountered in any reality. He received the throne knowledge in a series of transmissions that Lucifer delivered directly, mind to mind, bypassing the imprecision of notation. 3 weeks of sessions that left Kyle visibly shaken each time and visibly energized each time, the two states cycling rapidly enough that his senior magi grew genuinely concerned about his cognitive stability before concluding that what they were observing was not breakdown but breakthrough. The knowledge was not simple. Nothing about the Golden Throne was simple. The original engineering had been an act of metaphysical architecture that combined biological interface technology, warp containment principles, and psychic amplification systems in ways that had taken genius beyond standard human range to conceive, and would take genius approaching that range to properly understand. Kale understood it, imperfectly, partially, with gaps that would require decades of study to fill, but he understood enough to begin, to see the shape of the solution and know that it was real. He wept once during the 4th session, not from grief, from the specific overwhelming emotion of an engineer who has spent their career working around a problem they suspected was unsolvable and has just been shown incontrovertibly that it isn't. Lucifer pretended not to notice. Kyle was grateful for the pretense. The containment architecture took 4 months, not 3. The Grey Knight's review was thorough in the way that Sauvé did everything, completely, without shortcuts, with the kind of methodical rigor that could only come from someone who understood that the consequences of getting it wrong were not abstractly bad, but specifically catastrophic. He asked questions that were genuinely good. He identified 3 potential failure modes that Lucifer had considered, and one that he hadn't. And the one he hadn't caused Lucifer to spend 2 days restructuring a core component of the architecture's foundation before he was satisfied. He told Sove it was good work. Sove received the compliment with the expression of a man who had been told by a force of nature that his umbrella was adequate. Yela remained on Terra throughout. She had sent a communication to Ulthwé on the 2nd day, explaining her continued presence in terms that were technically informative and diplomatically impenetrable. The Autarch Council had responded with a message that was technically a recall order, and practically an acknowledgement that they had no mechanism for enforcing it. But she spent her time in the palace archives, the deep ones, the pre-heresy ones, the ones that hadn't been opened in centuries, and in long, irregular conversations with Lucifer that took place at odd hours and covered territory that neither of them discussed with anyone else. The shape of those conversations, had anyone been able to hear them, would have been recognizable as the specific dialogue of 2 very old and very tired beings who had each, in their own way, spent an enormous amount of time operating alone and were finding the alternative unexpectedly tolerable. On the morning of the 4th month's final day, Lucifer stood on the roof of the Imperial Palace's highest accessible spire, a platform of ancient stone at an altitude where Terra's atmosphere was thin enough to taste like nothing, and completed the containment architecture. It was not visible. It made no sound. It produced no dramatic visual phenomenon that the orbital defense arrays could track, or the astropaths could observe. From the outside, nothing appeared to change. Inside the warp, everything changed. The chaos powers felt it simultaneously. The boundary they had been eroding, grain by grain, since before the Imperium existed, suddenly resolidifying. Not becoming impenetrable, that was not what had been promised, and Lucifer kept his promises with the precision of someone who considered imprecision a form of dishonesty. But the permeability that had been allowing the slow, grinding expansion of chaos influence into real space, the tidal encroachment that the Imperium had been fighting with bodies and faith because it had no other tools, that permeability closed. The warp screamed. All 4 powers simultaneously, in the specific register of entities that have been operating in a particular way for so long that they have forgotten any other way is possible. Khorne's rage was the loudest, a roar that shook every psyker on Terra out of sleep and drove 3 of them temporarily catatonic. Tzeentch's response was more controlled, but more deeply furious. The fury of something that perceived all possible futures and had just watched an entire category of them collapse. Nurgle's response was, characteristically, the one that lingered longest, a slow, wet grief that pressed against the boundary like weather. Slaanesh simply went quiet, which was somehow worse than the others. Lucifer stood on the spire and let them scream. He felt the Lightbringer flame in his chest, running at 85%, still finding the absence of the presence's metaphysical scaffolding a constant low-grade friction, and he let it burn steady, not triumphant, not satisfied, just present, doing the thing it existed to do. Below him, Terra breathed. The Astronomicon pulsed with its steady, fierce light, brighter than it had been in decades, the first effects of the throne stabilization work already registering as a measurable improvement in the psychic beacon's output. Astropaths across the segmentum solar reported the change within hours. A clarity in the signal, a reduction in the interference that had been degrading long-distance communication for years. It was small. It was the beginning of small, but it was the direction that mattered, and the direction had changed. In the weeks that followed, 3 things happened that no analyst in the administratum would have predicted, though Yhela had seen fragments of all 3 in the skein and had chosen, for reasons she kept to herself, not to mention them to anyone. The first was that 7 Space Marine chapters, operating independently in different sectors, reported unsolicited contact from Xenos factions. Tau diplomatic envoys in 2 cases, an Eldar autarch in a 3rd, a delegation of Kroot in a 4th, proposing, with varying degrees of diplomatic formality, the cessation of ongoing low-intensity conflicts. Not peace treaties, not formal alliances, simply a cessation, offered without precondition, and by factions that had apparently received their own version of news from Terra and drawn their own conclusions about what the change in calculus meant. The second was that Abaddon the Despoiler, in the Eye of Terror, went quiet. His crusade forces, which had been building toward another push against the Cadian Gate, stood down. Not permanently. No one with knowledge of Abaddon believed in his permanent retirement from anything. But the stand down was real, and it lasted long enough to be significant. Within the Eye, sources suggested, in the fragmented, unreliable way that information from that region always suggested things, that Abaddon was engaged in something that looked, from the outside, like recalculation. The third thing was quieter than both. In the underhive districts of Terra's northern continent, in the Hab blocks and Manufactorum districts and Medicae wards that Lucifer had walked through during the 6-day adjournment, small changes began to accumulate. Better resource allocation, improved Medicae supplies, a reduction in the arbitrary enforcement actions that the Adeptus Arbits had been employing in the region for decades. Nothing structural, nothing dramatic, nothing that required an announcement or a formal policy shift. Just the small daily evidence of an institution that had been reminded by someone it could not ignore that its people existed. Lucifer noticed. He said nothing about it because some things were better when they happened without acknowledgement. When they happened because the people doing them had decided to, rather than because they were being observed. On the last morning before he intended to leave, not permanently, not finally, but for long enough to attend to things in his own reality that had been patient with his absence, he had breakfast with Yhela on a palace terrace in the thin Terran sunlight. She had asked him, the previous evening, if he was satisfied with what had been accomplished. He had told her to ask him in the morning. She asked. He looked out over the palace's vast, improbable architecture. The spires and buttresses and kilometer-high statues all catching the pale morning light. The Astronomicon's psychic pulse steady and slightly brighter than it had been, the distant city breathing its ancient, complicated breath. Satisfied implies completion, he said. This isn't complete, this is a beginning, which is more interesting than completion, and considerably more uncertain and dependent on a very large number of people continuing to choose the direction they've committed to choosing, which is the part I cannot control and have to trust. He picked up his coffee. Real coffee, sourced by Valdor Praxis from somewhere in the palace's deep storage at Lucifer's specific request, because some standards were non-negotiable even in the 41st millennium. So no, not satisfied, a pause, but present, which I haven't been, genuinely, in a very long time. Yela looked at him with her ancient, unreadable eyes. "You'll come back," she said, not a question. "The agreement requires consultation," he said, "and Kyle's distributed network project will need review at the 6-month stage." He looked at her steadily. "And the archives aren't finished. There are pre-fall records in the deep levels that your people's historians should know about. Records you lost in the fall that survived here, informs your farseers could reconstruct." A pause. "Someone should be present for that." Yela said nothing, but she didn't disagree. He left Terra that afternoon the same way he had arrived, without a vessel, without ceremony, stepping off the edge of the atmosphere and into the void with the unhurried ease of someone who found the journey interesting and the destination secondary. Below him, Terra turned slowly in the light of its ancient star. The Astronomicon burned steadily. The golden throne hummed with the sound of machinery that had been given, for the first time in millennia, the possibility of rest. In the deepest chamber of the imperial palace, a presence that had been holding for 10,000 years had begun, incrementally, infinitesimally, the first movement of something other than holding. In the warp, the boundary held. In the underhive, a woman of approximately 60 years walked to her shift at the manufactorum and noticed, for the first time, that the Medicin station on her block was staffed adequately. She noted this with the evaluating gaze of someone who distinguished between people who meant what they said and people who had learned to sound like they did. She decided, provisionally, to believe it. The morning Lucifer Morningstar left Terra, no one marked it officially. No edict was issued, no memorial carved, no saint day designated in the ecclesiarchal calendar. The administratum, which documented everything from munitions expenditure to atmospheric particulate levels, had no form for what had happened and no category in which to file it. The event existed in the official record as a series of incident reports, an unsigned adjournment notice, and a mechanicus technical acquisition log that would eventually be classified so deeply that only 3 people in the Imperium would ever read it. But it was remembered, not institutionally, personally, in the way that genuinely transformative things are always remembered, imperfectly, partially, filtered through the experience of each individual who had been present, carrying different weight for each of them. Valdor Praxis remembered a line of changed light under a door. Sov remembered a question asked in a courtyard that he had answered honestly and had never stopped examining. Yela Dawnseeker remembered a breakfast in thin sunlight and the specific quality of silence that followed a being admitting, for perhaps the first time in its existence, that it was present rather than merely enduring. Kale remembered weeping over an equation. Vorn remembered a clause she had written at 3 a.m, by hand, in the spare language of someone who meant exactly what they were saying, and the expression on an ancient face reading it. The Underhive woman remembered a Medici station. She would tell her daughter about it years later, not as a story about cosmic powers or divine intervention or the day the devil walked Terra, but as a story about a morning when something was different and stayed different. Her daughter would remember it that way too, and her daughter's daughter. This was, perhaps, the most significant thing Lucifer left behind. Not the containment architecture, not the throne knowledge, not the signed agreement in its sealed administratum vault. The most significant thing was the small, stubborn persistence of a changed direction, the accumulated weight of 10,000 daily choices trending, fractionally, incrementally, in a different way than before. It would not be a clean ascent. The Imperium would fail its commitments in places. Institutions would calcify. Fear would sometimes win. The war against chaos would continue, brutal and costly, because the containment architecture was not an ending, but a boundary, and boundaries required defending. But the tide had stopped rising, and somewhere beyond the edge of this reality, in the ambiguous territory between his old existence and this new and unexpected engagement with a universe that had managed, against considerable odds, to surprise him, Lucifer Morningstar kept his word. He came back. He always came back. The Emperor, in the deep, slow language of a mind learning to hope again, was beginning to understand why. The Emperor protects. More stories await.